All right, welcome to our first keynote. It is my very great pleasure to introduce Dr. Sylvie Tissot, who's a professor of political science at the University of Paris 8. Her research focuses on the intersection of class analysis and urban studies. Her book, Good Neighbors, Gentrifying Diversity in Boston South End, which was published by Verso in 2015, reveals how upper middle class newcomers have positioned themselves as champions of diversity and how their mobilization around this key concept has reordered class divisions rather than abolished them. Tissot has conducted other field-based research projects on so-called gay-friendly heterosexuals in France and the United States, culminating in her book, Gay Friendly, which was published by Polity in 2023. She's also an organizer and activist who engages in debates on feminism, race, and religion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sylvie Tissot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Oops. Does it work? Yeah, it does. Well, hi, everybody, and sorry you have to watch my face twice while I have the spectacular view. Anyway, thank you very much to Japonica and Loretta for organizing this great conference and inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here, especially here in Boston for obvious reasons. It's also a little bit intimidating to be invited to be a keynote speaker at a conference called Gentrification and Displacement, and to be implicitly asked to provide answers to the rather pressing question of what can we do about it. Well, what I can do at least is to present what, in my view, a sociological analysis that pays attention to class relations can bring to the study of gentrification. There are many, many ways to analyze urban transformations generated by gentrification. I would like to offer a few suggestions about the ways in which we can and should integrate class issues in the study of gentrification. And I will use the perspective I developed in Boston when I studied gentrification in Boston, not far from here in the South End, and more recently in New York and Paris. And I'm well aware that those Western cities belong to the classical cases of gentrification, those which have been studied for a long time. So I'll try and extend my horizons with other examples, but I'm sure I will, and I have already learned a lot from the incredible diversity of case studies that will be presented during the conference. So I would like to argue that in order to understand urban changes, we can have a perspective focused on gentrifiers, yet which does not obscure economic forces nor public intervention that play a crucial role in the transformation of inner city neighborhoods. While displacement undoubtedly results from gentrification, but this perspective, at least my perspective, leads to examine something that precedes displacement in a way, which is the coexistence between groups that live in the same neighborhood and the unequal relations between these different groups. So if we agree that gentrification is a problem, or at least that it is a clear manifestation of the widening inequalities at the beginning of the 21st century, and if we agree that studying it might raise awareness about social and racial injustice, I believe we need to understand the class relations that are, in my view, characteristic of the situation of gentrification. This is what I will try to argue here. Gentrification implies or generates specific power relations that need to be empirically investigated. So in order to do that, I will start with the tricky question of how we define gentrifiers. And I will argue that despite the diversity of the group, one of its characteristics is the possession of cultural capital and not only economic capital. And that makes these residents particularly resourceful, particularly creative, inventive to appropriate a neighborhood, the process of appropriation being, in my view, synonymous with gentrification. And then I will explain what I mean by a specific class relation. And my hope is that this kind of analysis can be useful for all who think gentrification is a problem. However, the relations between academics, activists, policymakers, or the relationships between science and action is not an easy one. And I will try to go back to that at the end of my talk. Well, first of all, and many people, including people who are here, have said and written that already what we define as gentrifiers depends on the context, on the stage of gentrification, and this plurality has to be taken into account. Because there is gentrification somewhere doesn't mean that there are gentrifiers with the same resources, the same values, lifestyle, taste, and motivations. And only, I believe, through an examination of their residential, social, and sometimes personal trajectory and their exact position in the social hierarchy in a specific context, can we understand what these people will do in the neighborhood and to the neighborhood that move in. Will they buy property or rent? In what cafes and restaurants will they drink and eat, if they do? Will they be inclined to join a local association or be politically active? Will they seek to preserve the authenticity of the place, like the social preservationists studied by Japonica, or laments the visibility of non-white people? All this requires an investigation of where they come from, what lifestyle and aspirations they bring with them, what resources, not only economic, but cultural, they have. So I'm going to give you a few examples and so a few insights of Boston for those who don't know this fascinating city. So for instance, a young white lawyer who grew up in a wealthy suburb of Boston and went to Harvard University during the social upheavals of the 60s, moved to the South End, then considered a slum. His parents would never have set foot there. As well as working with the progressive mayor elected in 1968, rather than for a prestigious law firm. His moving to the South End was a political statement, as well as a convenient location, close to downtown. Once settled in the neighborhood, his wife, who was also committed to the war on poverty, tried to establish a dialogue between white and Black mothers at a local school. In spite of strong motivations, she increasingly became annoyed by the presence of prostitutes in the alley behind their house. Both joined a group of goodwill inhabitants who feared extreme positions, one being represented by the Black leader, Mel King. Battles raged at that time in the South End, and actually no one could have predicted the issue of those battles. And that the white newcomers would eventually win. In the late 70s, so this couple eventually moved to Newton, exactly where they had grown up. More than 30 years later, in 1992, a retired white engineer moved to the same neighborhood, but a different location. Further east on Washington Street, once a dilapidated section of the South End, but now under renovation. The elevated train had already been demolished. His age and professional category offer a profile rather different from the young households generally imagined as the gentrifiers, like the couple I've just told you about. Indeed, he's one of the upper middle class, early retired people who, after raising their kids in the comfort of the suburbs, moved to the South End in search of an urban lifestyle and a closer sociability, which essentially means going to nice restaurants. At a time when most activist groups had disappeared, while the local balance of power is totally different, he joined a neighborhood association and also the board of an organization financed by a federal program supporting the commercial development of old neighborhoods. And this renovation paved the way for the opening of new restaurants designed for a well-off clientele, the renovation of Peters Park, and the creation of a dog park in this park. Well, last example, going back to the 60s. A lesbian woman, a clinical psychologist who graduated from Harvard, she and her partner, both white, moved to the South End. It was urban renewal, and the building where they rented was demolished. They applied for financial assistance for relocation, but the BRA, so the Boston Redevelopment Authority, which was implementing the urban renewal program, was very reluctant to accept the application, considering that it was for families only. Eventually, the South End was a site for integration for her and for her partner. And so this woman was very active in the community gardens movement, community gardens which were progressively taken over by gentrifiers who tended to grow different plants than the plants that had been cultivated by African American and Chinese people in the South End. Well, this woman found integration, not because she could be out. I wasn't out because the term out hadn't been invented. Everybody was in the closet, she told me. But because she and her partner, as middle-class people fixing up their property, were considered allies by the other homeowners. And she went on explaining to me. Well, they didn't care what they were. They didn't care that we were a lesbian couple. We were fixing up the property, which was a wreck, and they were delighted. Middle class is middle class. I would nonetheless find out that one neighborhood association, not the neighborhood association where they lived, another neighborhood association. When I dig into the old papers of this neighborhood association had very vehemently opposed the opening of a bar for women in 1982, just to give you an indication of this relative acceptance. Well, because of different contexts and different profiles, these people didn't project themselves in the neighborhood the same way. They didn't expect the same things, and they didn't have the same engagement and activities. And we can find many other examples. Well, nevertheless, beyond this diversity, something similar is often to be found, without necessarily going back to the discussion about the new middle classes. But we know that the occupational structure of advanced capitalist societies has changed, and that the development of the welfare state and the increase in service employment resulted in an expansion of the professionals with a high level of education in the decades following World War II. Well, gentrifiers belong to the middle class or the upper middle class. And they have a certain proportion of cultural capital compared to the economic capital that make them more inclined to display progressive attitudes and less traditional values. Well, having said that, we might be tempted to either naively celebrate this progressiveness or consider it sheer hypocrisy, which I'm not sure is the relevant perspective. Well, because first of all, it's clear that intentions, even good ones, do not place people outside of social relations and the distribution of privileges. At the same time, ignoring the claims of openness, of progressiveness, is not satisfactory either, because they are part of what we study. It's not something we measure or we assess, something we study. And principles and values manifest themselves in certain practices, as I will explain later. Well, if I emphasize the cultural capital that can be measured by education that entails specific tastes, values, practices, etc. It is because it represents an extremely valuable resource. Let me explain that. Of course, economic resources are crucial because it gives access to property ownership, and also we know that newcomers with higher income contribute to reorganizing the local retail sector. However, cultural resources are a key element to appropriate a space. And here's my point. Appropriation is never an automatic, inevitable, ineluctable process resulting from public policies or economic forces. It needs work in a way. And I want to give you some examples of how gentrifiers collectively, and most often not consciously or intentionally, fabricate gentrification, so to speak. So let's go back to my first example, the first couple who moved to the South End in the 60s. Well, while being eager to make a difference and to contribute to the war on poverty, they faced the stigmatization of living in a slum or a neighborhood that was considered a slum by their parents, their friends, etc. They joined the Historical Society, which was created in the late 60s. And this association was started by newcomers with distinctive social characteristics. They were bankers, architects, planners. They were closest to the upper classes, to the bourgeoisie, and they had some links with the most prestigious cultural and social institutions of Boston. They were opposed to urban renewal and demolition, like many people in the 60s, even among urban planners, but not for specific reasons. But by creating this association, they also used their cultural capital to revalorize the neighborhood. So the association, thanks to their engagements, gained the historical designation for the neighborhood in the early 80s. And through many activities, balls, tours, etc., concerts, they progressively changed the reputation of a slum into a neighborhood with a remarkable Victorian architecture. And the enterprise was not only cultural, it was political. The designation historic and the demolition, but more importantly at that time, the association countered the organizing work of Black and Latino activist groups who advocated for public housing programs in the neighborhood. And they were very active and very vocal and very hostile to the Historical Society. In the name of the preservation of old Victorian architecture and in the name of the environment, they called for the end of the construction of subsidized housing in the South End, and they managed to do it. So political struggles play out through symbolic battles around, it played out through symbolic battles around the narrative of the South End. The Historical Society glorified, when you look at all the documents and the leaflets that they wrote, they glorified the social elite that created the neighborhood in the 19th century. And then they associated the poor population and the migrants who arrived at the end of the 19th century to the South End with its decline. And eventually they celebrated a renaissance that could take place thanks to the contemporary urban pioneers. So it's a very specific narrative. Well, as I said, focusing on gentrifiers does not mean obscuring economic forces. Sometimes, I think, it even helps understanding economic forces. Indeed, the cultural enterprise of the Historical Society had also a huge economic impact. The tours organized by the local group showed another reality to the suburbanites who started seeing Victorian architecture rather than dilapidated buildings. And here again, the gentrifier's profile is enlightening. Several leaders of the Historical Association were also real estate agents who dominated the South End property market until the 80s. And this is important because gentrification, like in many other cities, accelerated as major financial institutions, corporate investors, and large consolidated real estate firms arrived in the 90s. But they could do that, all these big firms, they could do that because small brokers, so the members of the Historical Society, they were called the kitchen brokers, they had bought, renovated, and resold properties in the neighborhoods since the 60s. So they managed to create a new category of perception, historic district, which allowed them to reorganize the real estate market around a new product, the Victorian brownstone. In other words, economic phenomena, including upgrading of urban spaces, are based on and generated by social forces. So you see my attachment to sociology here. Well, of course, if the members of the Historical Society succeeded in imposing their views and their interests, it's because they benefited from a new federal legislation that encouraged the historic preservation movement everywhere in the country. Then that was not limited to Boston. It actually started in New York. So they did not invent something on their own from scratch. Very often, gentrifiers find support from public authorities, and sometimes when a new elected mayor seeks to consolidate his or her constituency, and it was the case in Boston when a new progressive mayor was elected in 1968. And so when these new mayors, they often use resident participation to negotiate with and favor white middle-class residents. On a more global level, the growth of tourism, Airbnb now, they have a huge impact in many countries, for instance, in Greece. And I want to mention the wonderful work of my colleague Thomas Maloutas, who demonstrated that in Exarchia, in the center of Athens, the real estate transactions dramatically increased from 2013 until now at the low prices attracted investors. So now the neighborhood is gentrifying. But it remains to be seen, I think, how gentrifiers, how the newcomers will create a new image, a new representation of Exarchia, and bring different lifestyles from those that the anarchist groups, which have been very present in Exarchia. I don't know if you know the city. Those different than those that the anarchist groups have imprinted on public space. So there's still a work of gentrification to be done, which needs to study the gentrifiers. So what I want to emphasize here is the inventiveness of gentrifiers and the role they play in the appropriation of spaces, because spatial appropriation is never automatic, no matter how powerful economic and political forces can be. And this is true of real estate, as explained for the Historical Society and the brownstone, but also of public space. And I want to be clear, if I speak of the inventiveness or creativity, it is not to argue like Richard Florida that there is a creative class that is key factor for economic development, and it's wonderful. From a more sociological and neutral perspective, I consider gentrifiers as a creative class in the sense that they have the cultural resources to shape new representations, to invent practices, tastes, and lifestyles in order to significantly transform a neighborhood, as well as transforming themselves sometimes. And the range of cultural resources is very wide. It can be the most traditional cultural capital, like the culture of the elite, as it was the case for the South End Historical Society, which organized balls, concerts, invited his friends, etc. But the middle class with cultural capital is often well equipped to use tastes belonging to low-income groups or racial minorities and turn them into something chic. They are able to add value to something that used to be ignored or even stigmatized. And many, many examples eliminate the processes through which the representation of spaces change depending on the context, of course. And here again, the inventiveness is striking. In Buenos Aires, my colleague Silvia Hernandez showed that in addition to art and music, the insistence on the industrial heritage was a key element for the revalorization of Barracas, a neighborhood that was once part of the south of the city, which was considered a problem area because of crime and poverty. And progressively, Barracas became a neighborhood of the authentic south. Why authentic? Well, the image was created by using some elements, and surprising elements, of the industrial past, and for instance, the smell of biscuits that used to be made in local factories. So you wouldn't automatically associate biscuits, the smell of biscuits, with factories, but that's how it happened. And food is a fascinating side of observation. We had some examples this morning of how gentrifiers can appreciate traditional dishes of southern continents, thus praising exoticism and multiculturalism. In Paris, some restaurants traditionally run by Kurdish people, which used to cater to a working class population or young people who go out very late or very early in the morning and enjoy, buying kebabs. While some of these restaurants have renovated the place, raised their price, and sell chic kebab. And let's remember that at the same time, the traditional kebabs are still seen by local authorities, especially in small cities, as a sign of urban decline. So what I'm saying with this example is that taste and distaste work together. The appreciation of specific tastes and the appreciation of specific groups come with the stigmatization of other tastes and other groups, most often racial minorities. And symbolic class struggles play out here. In the South, and it was striking that the Southern food, the soul food associated with African Americans could not be revalorized. I mean, it could be in neighborhoods in New York City, maybe, but not in the south of Boston. It remained a powerful deterrent in culinary tastes. And let's remember that these struggles are neither conscious nor intentional most of the time. The emergence of new taste is rooted in economic forces that encourage retail owners to develop new products. Yet I insist on the gentrifiers' creativity for two reasons. Well, first, the appropriation of a space is symbolic as much as economic and material. A group of newcomers needs to legitimize its presence through a specific lifestyle that is neither lifestyle of the traditional bourgeoisie nor the lifestyle of the old-timers. In the neighborhoods of Fener and Banat in Istanbul, gentrifiers emphasize the historical heritage and the cosmopolitan part of the neighborhoods. And while UNESCO helps renovating old houses, gentrifiers, some of whom come from outside of the country, feel the urge to legitimize their presence. In addition to that, cultural resources are an essential element because gentrifiers most often, they face contradictions and feel contradictions. Let me explain that. In Montreuil, a city in the east of Paris that is still gentrifying, my colleague Anaïs Collet showed that in the 90s, middle-class families living in the northeastern part of Paris moved to Montreuil to buy property. The northeastern part of Paris was already too expensive for them. And Montreuil, so right outside of the city, and the east was more affordable. Yet, crossing the border between Paris and the suburbs was challenging. The suburbs, in the French sense of the word, on the periphery of Paris, being associated, with all kinds of social ills, social housing, crime, etc. And Montreuil was seen as a suburb city with a high percentage of social housing, a high percentage of migrants, etc., etc. In the section bordering Paris, no huge projects that are a symbol of suburbs or banlieue in French. but small buildings and semi-detached houses. No ancient architecture, like in South End, like in other neighborhoods, like in Le Marais in Paris, for instance. So what did the gentrifiers invent? They invented a representation of the neighborhood as a mixed space, where what is actually valued is the fact that there is no architectural homogeneity, and that it is why it is so charming. And so eventually, next to Paris, that is divided into 20 districts, arrondissements, this section of the suburb city of Montreuil became the 21st arrondissement of Paris, symbolically. So once again, a symbolic destigmatization or revalorization that contributed to reorganizing the real estate market. Okay, now, why is class so important when we speak about gentrification? Because gentrification reinforces housing inequalities, of course, because appropriation is made possible through the various resources possessed by gentrifier, and finally, because I argue that gentrification is a site for a novel kind of domination. And that's why gentrification is a fascinating object. It's because it offers a perspective on class stratification and how social reproduction works. Gentrification, in my view, is mainly about, maybe, I don't know, I mean, from my sociological perspective, is about controlling a diversity that gentrifiers at the same time claim to love. And as I said, gentrifiers are part of a middle class or an upper middle class that often portray themselves as progressive. And this is not sheer window dressing. Some implement their values, notably by socializing newcomers to diversity. But this commitment to diversity is often intrinsically linked to the gentrifier's capacity to control it. For instance, in 2007, so I was in the South End homeless shelter, which bought 3 buildings in the order to accommodate formerly homeless people. They bought 3 buildings. And when the shelter made their plan public, a group of residents wrote and circulated a petition demanding that 2 of the 3 buildings be sold at market rates. They explained that they did not want too many low-income residents on the street and that they valued owners rather than renters. Opposing this small group of angry people, other residents created a welcoming committee, which campaigned in defense of the shelter, organized public meetings, and started negotiations between the nonprofit organization and the angry residents. They encouraged the shelter to private document answering questions relating to size, screening, and supervision of the residents. They asked the shelter to implement strict rules in terms of guests, smoking, and sitting on the stoops. During one meeting I attended, the Black leader, Melking, you remember Melking, expressed his view that the welcoming committee should simply dismiss the selfish and racist yuppies. So I mentioned earlier that Melking steered a lot of hostility among newcomers in the 60s and 70s, while in 2007, as I observed, nobody really listened to him. I mean, he was a respected character, but nobody was scared of him anymore. Eventually, the negotiation resulted in a significant decrease in the number of renters and a plan to have a minimum percentage of middle-income residents. In the course of promoting peaceful relations, progressive residents committed to a diversity, and this is a real commitment. But they were careful to take a strong role in organizing local relations and controlling the proportion of each group, which makes up diversity. And since the 60s, a network of community groups, not only the historical society, but plenty of other groups, have organized a specifically local power that promotes diversity. Some are more conservative, like the historical society, some are more progressive, and they might not have the same definition of what diversity is. They nonetheless agree on one thing. they have the right to define and control what diversity must be. Okay, so I'll skip Le Marais and Park Slope. In my conclusion, I would like to go back to the tricky question of the relationships between academics and people who try to promote changes, essentially activists. I consider myself a feminist activist and an activist against neoliberal policies that progressively dismantle now the French public system of higher education, including my university, located north of Paris in a still mixed and still working class city, Saint-Denis. And let me point out that my university will definitely not benefit from all the urban renovations planned for the Olympic Games, and all the events that will take place in the area around Saint-Denis next year. Except maybe for a few bike lanes, the students of my university who live there will not either. Well, we already know from previous cases such as Barcelona and London, Olympic Games can be powerful forces toward gentrification, directly encouraged by public authorities, which is the case in Paris. Well, now, in light of sociological studies, what can we say about possible changes? Well, if neoliberal policies are undoubtedly responsible here, diversity policies will not enough to oppose them. In many countries, including UK, social mix has been at the forefront of neighborhood renewal or urban regeneration policies that have only reinforced urban segregation. Through the slogan of diversity, the dignity of minorities is acknowledged, and this might represent a huge progress. And we should be careful that the rising extreme right movements and governments everywhere, especially in Europe, are attacking diversity policies. Well, still, in the name of diversity, gentrifiers establish themselves as a dominant group of the neighborhood in the South End and in other neighborhoods. The only group that really has a say. So one can ask ourselves, is the promotion of diversity the solution to gentrification, or is it part of the problem? Do low-income people need affordable housing and stores where they can shop, or do they need to live in a diverse neighborhood or a diverse building with a high percentage of middle-class people? Well, let me finish with a few words about how useful sociology can be. First of all, I think the sociological perspective establishes the idea that social phenomena are not ineluctable. They are not unavoidable. The appropriation of poor neighborhoods is engineered by various groups and institutions. And if the phenomena is not natural, if it has been fabricated in a way, something else can happen in the future. And understanding the current processes help envision a different future. And this is true when we consider symbolic struggles and the invention of narratives that glorify certain groups, certain periods of history, and eventually gentrifiers committed to the Renaissance. Questioning the accuracy of these narratives can be useful to acknowledge the contribution of other groups that have been present in the neighborhood for a long time. Well, in this presentation, I insisted on the profile of gentrifiers in order to understand their engagement in the neighborhood and how they have eventually transformed it. Bringing into light the collective forces that lie beyond good intention might seem harsh, yet whether people have good intentions or not is not really the point for social scientists. Not to mention that I don't know how we can empirically explore the real intentions. The light we shed on unconscious strategies, euphemized power relations, social distinction playing out through individual tastes might hurt some feelings. And I know I heard the feelings of some of the people I interviewed in the South End who had been nice to me and maybe did not expect I would develop such an analysis, no matter how nuanced I wanted the analysis to be. Yet there are very privileged people who have probably recovered. And did I hope that they would become more aware of their privileges? I'm not sure, but it can be a discussion. It's part of our job. I'm more inclined to think that attitudes change when the material structures and the distribution of resources change. And I'm convinced that the role of activists is decisive in that respect. Well, to finish, I would like to express an optimistic view based on the fact that the concept of gentrification is now widely used by scholars and activists, and it's not used by local authorities who do not want to address such issues. They don't like the word. So somehow scholars and activists and other people who try to promote changes meet through words, and words such as gentrification entails an awareness of class and race issues that of course remain to be discussed and analyzed. And this is not easy because classes are never the exact and automatic translation of capitalism. There are changing groups which can also transform themselves to uphold their privileges. And I hope the sociological perspective can help grasp these subtle changes in social stratification that are so intrinsically linked to urban transformations. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. So we have 15 minutes for questions, and then we will head across the street for lunch. So I will let you take the questions if you want to. Okay, thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lorena. I am from the University of Amsterdam, but I am from Lima. I consider myself a gentrifier, to be honest. I think not most, but some of the people here might be playing that role as well, without wanting to harm anyone. I want to say something very briefly. My mom had a very poor pension, so she lived from her rents because she didn't have any other option. She rented rooms and she bought 2 small apartments in the city. And then after years of studying, I realized that that is a problem as well. So what I want to say overall is that I found this overview very interesting, but I feel that it's just because it's not to put the gentrifier against the person that is going to be gentrified. I think it's not about that, because this confrontation that is quite polarizing might not be helpful to solve the underlying issues behind. So I think there might be people that are involved in this kind of social process, which is gentrification, that they don't even notice what role they are playing. So, and I'm not trying to say, oh yeah, we are so innocent. I'm trying to say that this is more about policy and how to control this kind of, let's say, renovation plans that also involve the middle class, than maybe blaming the middle class itself. I don't know. That's at least my opinion. Thank you.
Shall I answer? Yeah, thank you for this great question, because it will allow me to elaborate a little bit more about my perspective. I myself, I'm a gentrifier. I live in Montreuil, which is a slowly gentrifying city. And I think the question of sociology is not really about finding the enemies or blaming people or trying to find the innocent people. I think science has something very different to do than moral. As a citizen, I can have moral judgments, and of course I have political judgments too. But I think we need to differentiate the perspective, because if we do not, what can we do? I mean, and we don't need science. If the only goal is to find the enemies, we don't really need science. We just need to follow our political judgments, which might be interesting, but in my view, it's not about that. So going back to your question about the polarization and what seemed to be a binary a view on the population living in gentrifying or gentrified neighborhood. It's not at all how I studied gentrification in the South End, because it was not possible to really distinguish between gentrifiers and gentrified people, especially at the beginning, but even at the end. And if a group of gentrifiers, through all this association, managed to build a local power, which really managed to, impose their view on the neighborhood, it's also because they made some alliances with old-timers, and not anyone, some with particular profiles too. That's why we need not to say, okay, let's see where the gentrifiers are and let's see where the gentrified people are. It's how people arriving with a specific profile, specific social characteristic, made alliance with other people already living there, but with some specific also profiles. Not the Black community, not the Black activist community, not the Hispanic activist community, but with some old-timer who started, for instance, neighborhood watch patrols. Or all the owners, mostly women, who owned a lot of lodging houses, of rooming houses, who did not belong to the middle class. They had no cultural capital. They didn't join the historical society. This historical society didn't want them. But they really supported all the efforts, to renovate the neighborhood. For instance, to get rid of a lot of bars, which were considered like not nice places, and getting rid of this bar through a task force that was created in 1975 was very instrumental in changing public space and also all the restaurant and cafe sectors. So I'm a bit long, but I totally agree with your critique of how does it help understanding anything to oppose gentrifiers and gentrified people from a political perspective, but also from a scientific perspective. Sorry if I gave a wrong impression on that.
So, and I'm in Birmingham, Alabama, and I know in the southeastern United States, and especially, I can speak especially about Birmingham, a lot of our gentrification has been white wealth displacing low-income Black spaces. It's primarily that dynamic. Increasingly, we are seeing, it's been happening for a while in cities like Atlanta, but for example, we're seeing it more in Birmingham right now, where we have Black wealth displacing Black poverty. So we've gone from, it's always a racialized narrative, especially because it's in the context of historical and enduring white supremacy, but it is, it's a wealth, race, power dynamic that weaves around a lot of things. And I'm sort of tossing that out as a concept for your comment and reflection.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Yes, I had a question about, and this may have been addressed in your book. I have not been able to read it, but you mentioned that there was Latino and Black activists or organizations that were sort of resisting. I don't know if it was necessarily gentrification, urban renewal, but there was some elements of resistance. I know that in a lot of our literature that we're working on, it often has this narrative of the gentrifier versus the gentrified, or sort of the state and the gentrified, et cetera, et cetera. It's always sort of focusing on, I guess, the elements that create it. But how were you able to sort of explore more about those that were resisting it? And especially when thinking about, for example, in a course I've taken, we looked at, I think it was in either LA or another California city, where there was sort of a lot of Latin American people there, a lot of Chicanos who came out of sort of the university system in the 60s and 70s, who might have been seen as this sort of like the gentrifiers, but were sort of instrumental in resisting against the state kind of gentrifying and sort of removing Latino areas that were sort of seen as historical and sort of seen as like a block away from, further development and further beautification of the city. So were you able to sort of explore more of the facets?
Yeah. Thanks a lot for the question. When I arrived in the South End and I started field work, I didn't think I would do much like historical research. Of course, I would read books about the South End, about Boston, etc. But I'm not a historian, so I wasn't really prepared to do that. And at some point I met a resident, long-time resident. He moved in the 60s, and he was a member of the welcoming committee. And so I interviewed him, and he developed a very interesting rhetoric about him being an adventurer, moving in a slum, and that, that homeowners were the real, heroes, people who took risk, but really portraying himself as like the nice gentrifiers opposing the angry residents who didn't want diversity. It was like a very common rhetoric. And then I found out about another group, the South End for a group of people for a balanced South End. I don't remember the exact denomination of the group, a balanced, with many people of the historical society who joined this group, who actively fought the building of social housing in the South End then. I mean, they were very vocal, very, very conservative. And I found out that he was a member of this group, which he had never mentioned to me. And that's how I figured out that I have to understand the local balance of power to understand what somebody can do when he or she arrives in the neighborhood. So who has the power? And back then in the 60s, battles raged in the South End, and the activist groups were numerous. So I mentioned Mel King, but there were other very radical groups, Black activists, Latino activists, plenty of other groups fighting all kinds of different causes. And also, and it's hard to speak about the other sides, but I spoke about the first couple. He joined people like moderate people, and then you had the historical society. So it's the political field in a way has to really to be investigated to understand. Otherwise, you cannot understand why these people moved, why they moved out, and what they did in the neighborhood. And I guess it's the same for any context. So yeah, sure, taking into account the resistance is very important. Later on, and in 2007, 2008, when the Welcoming Committee was created, the power dynamic has totally changed. So here you see battles among people who think that we have to defend, diversity, and we do not agree on what proportion of diversity we should implement, but almost everybody agrees, except Mel King, but everybody agrees on the fact that there is a group of people, and mostly white homeowner people, who has a right to control this diversity, to fight for it, and really fight for it. That's why they're not the bad people. Or I don't consider them the bad people.
Hi, how are you? My name is Joy Doyle. I'm at the University of the District of Columbia. I also come representing as the Advisory Neighborhood Commissioner for the single member district 8CO2 in Washington, DC. I am a Black gentrifier. I have moved from Virginia into a underserved and marginalized community 18 years ago. In my work in developing an archetype for a Black gentrifier in my single member district and area, I have come to see that we really exist in silos. So when Black people are living amongst Black people, we can just exist in the neighborhood. But it really wasn't until the pandemic that, I'm sitting on my porch, people are starting to walk the neighborhood, that we're just starting to say hello, we're breaking the silos. And just in saying hello, I find out we have a team of attorneys, we have physicians, we have SES in the government, we have CPAs, we have all of these Black professionals that live in this single member district that I represent. I agree with quite a few things that you're saying. And I also believe that through this silo mentality behavior that I am a part of and have been a part of, and that I'm working to break now as a commissioner, I think that when we're looking at the word control and where the power rests, I think that we need to define that outside of a monolithic lens where it be white people or Black people, because we have a lot of power, we have economic power. I do not put my kids in the neighborhood school. I did not vote in local elections. I put none of my money into the neighborhood. I don't even have equitable access to public space because we're a city under siege right now, and our politicians are really not taking action to change this around for everyone in the community. And I know I'm long-winded, but it's, as we are going through third wave gentrification in this area, the last place in Washington, D.C. with the most land, I would like to ask ways that we as Black gentrifiers can start working with our city officials who are also majority Black, but stopping the practice of engaging us through a monolithic lens so we can put our resources to good use to actually make positive, sustainable change for a community.
Maybe just one more word, but I think there was a question. Well, I think studying what gentrifiers and all kind of gentrifiers do show that there is a wide range of possible behaviors and attitudes. And what sociology says or shows that it's linked to a lot of parameters, mainly social characteristics. But there is a wide range of possible behaviors and attitudes. So that leave the possibility of, decisions, maybe not free will, something that addicts, but decisions. And if sociology can help, in that respect, it's, I think, a good thing.
On that note, we have to end.
Okay.
Time for lunch.
He could not. Somebody from the South End. Okay. Okay. So one comment more than a question.
Sylvie, good morning. My name's Ken Crookmeyer. I live in the South End. I'm going to be running the tour of the South End on Saturday. You interviewed me, and I got your book immediately when it came out, and it is filled, I've looked back at it, with notes on virtually every page. My question is, because I agree with very many of your conclusions, and I know that very many of my neighbors really violently dislike the book. Is it a matter of presentation or is it a matter of conclusions?
You know better than me. I was really careful in terms of, you mean the writing, how I wrote the argument, how I developed the argument. Yeah, I really wanted to have it, nuanced and really substantiated by, evidence and data. It's not like a political pamphlet. It's really I think, scientific work. So
A friend of mine who's a sociologist who read it said, oh yes, it was written by a French person. And that's the way they do research, and that's the way they write about research, which is different than the way she grew up learning about research and writing in Pennsylvania. And for me, I think sometimes the presentation made it hard for me to come to the same conclusions that I agree with you on.
yeah, right. Thanks for your feedback.
I
Thanks a
really,
lot.
but I really appreciate your thoughts and the complexity of
Yeah.
this question, which is being raised by several people who've asked questions.
Thank you so much.